Claire never asked for equal treatment. She just never expected the difference to be $80,000 and a verdict on her marriage delivered in the same conversation. She had built her life carefully and honestly, finished her degree, found work she believed in, married a woman she loved completely, not as an act of rebellion or a statement to anyone, but because love arrived and she recognized it and said yes. She had hoped her parents would find their way to acceptance eventually. She knew it might take time. She gave them time. What they gave her instead was a label. A judgment wrapped in scripture and delivered with the particular certainty of people who had decided God was on their side of the argument. And then, in the same year, in the same breath almost, they gave her sister $80,000, a house down payment, a wedding gift, a financial foundation handed over with joy and celebration, and the full warmth of parents investing in a future they approved of. Claire received none of it, not a conversation about it, not an acknowledgement that the difference existed. She didn't ask for an explanation. She didn't argue or beg or make them feel the size of what they had done. She built her own foundation, slowly, deliberately, with her wife beside her, and she moved forward without looking back. 3 years later, her parents appeared at her door. The $80,000 was gone. Her sister's marriage had collapsed. Her parents had been quietly unraveling for months and had arrived at the one door they had treated as closed, hoping it might still open. Claire looked at them on that porch. And then she made a decision that nobody who knew her history could have predicted. $80,000 to her sister. A sin verdict to Claire. 3 years later, they showed up at her door. Subscribe and ring that bell, because what Claire decides to do when she opens that door is the last thing anyone expected. My name is Claire Merritt. I'm 32 years old and I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I have a wife named Diane who is brilliant and funny, and the most clear-eyed person I have ever known, clear-eyed in the specific way of someone who has never needed other people's approval to understand her own value. We have been married for 3 years. We have a house we bought ourselves, and a life we built from the ground up without a single dollar of help from anyone who shares my last name. My parents have never referred to Diane as my wife. They have never acknowledged our marriage as real. They gave my sister $80,000 the same year they called what I have with Diane a sin. I'm going to tell you everything that happened after that, including the part where they came back. My parents loved me. I want to say that clearly and first because it is true and because the story gets complicated in ways that require that truth as a foundation. They were present and involved, and there were genuinely good years, family dinners and road trips, and a particular kind of Saturday morning that felt like the safest place in the world. But their love had a shape. A specific, defined shape that I fit inside easily until I didn't. My father's faith was not incidental to his identity. It was the organizing structure of everything, including how he understood family and marriage, and which futures he could celebrate and which ones he couldn't. I knew this about him. I had known it for years before I told him anything. Knowing didn't make the telling easier. It just meant I wasn't surprised by what came after. I came out to my parents on a Sunday afternoon at their kitchen table in the house I had grown up in. I was 26. I had spent 2 years deciding when and how, and had ultimately concluded that there was no version of this conversation that was easy, and therefore the timing didn't matter as much as the doing of it. My mother cried quietly and said she loved me and that she needed time. My father opened his Bible, not aggressively, not performatively, in the specific way of a man reaching for the thing that made sense of things that didn't make sense to him otherwise. He read something. Then he looked at me and said the word sin with the absolute certainty of someone quoting something they consider settled. I sat at that kitchen table and received it and drove home alone, and did not cry until I was through my own front door. My sister Emma got engaged 8 months after my coming out conversation. She was 24 and her fiancé was a man named Derek, who my parents had met twice and already loved in the specific way parents love the people their children choose, when those choices confirm everything they hoped for. The family response to Emma's engagement was exactly what engagement announcements are supposed to generate: calls, dinners, planning conversations that went late into the evening, my mother pulling out her own wedding album for the first time in years. I attended the celebration dinner and smiled genuinely because I loved my sister and her happiness was real, and it deserved to be celebrated. But I sat at that table and felt the specific texture of a contrast that nobody else in the room appeared to notice or feel the need to acknowledge. Emma called me on a Tuesday evening about 6 months before her wedding with the warm, excited energy of someone in the middle of planning the biggest day of her life. She mentioned the house they were looking at. Then she mentioned, in the same casual breath, that Mom and Dad had given them the down payment. I asked how much, not from calculation, just from the particular reflex of someone who has just heard something that requires a number to be fully understood. She told me $80,000. She said it the way you say amounts that feel enormous but have already been absorbed into the new reality of your life, with a kind of fond disbelief rather than active awareness of its weight. I said that was wonderful. I meant it for her genuinely. But after I hung up, I sat in my apartment and let the number exist in the room with me for a long time. I told Diane that evening. I told her the number and the context and the whole shape of the conversation with Emma. Diane listened the way she always listened, completely, without filling the space prematurely with her own response. When I finished, she didn't perform outrage on my behalf, or minimize what I was feeling or redirect toward the practical. She just sat with me in it for a moment. Then she said something that was simple and true, and that I have returned to many times since. She said, "They told you what they think we're worth, and we get to decide whether they're right." I looked at her across the room and understood at that moment that I had married someone who was going to help me build something completely regardless of whether anyone else thought we deserved to. That understanding was its own kind of foundation. I didn't call my parents about the $80,000. Didn't write a letter or send a message or raise it at the next family dinner in the careful sideways way of someone making a point while pretending not to make one. I made a decision instead, and it was the kind of decision that doesn't announce itself loudly, because its power is entirely in the execution rather than the declaration. I decided I was going to build everything my parents had handed my sister and withheld from me: a home, financial security. A life so evidently solid and full and real that the absence of their investment in it would become increasingly difficult for anyone to frame as a deficit in what Diane and I had rather than in what they had chosen to give. I was going to build it without asking them for anything, and I was going to take exactly as long as it took. Diane and I started from exactly what we had: two incomes, moderate savings, no family money behind us, and no expectation that any was coming. We made a budget that was honest about where we were and methodical about where we were going. We cut things that didn't build anything and kept things that did. We opened a dedicated savings account the week after the $80,000 conversation and set up an automatic transfer that we never touched regardless of what the month looked like. It wasn't dramatic or fast or the kind of financial story that gets told at dinner parties. It was just two people doing the unglamorous daily work of building something from nothing because nobody else was going to do it for them, and they had decided that was acceptable. It was more than acceptable. It was entirely ours. Christmas that year was the first gathering after Emma's wedding, which I had attended with Deanne, which my parents had tolerated with the particular strained warmth of people performing acceptance they hadn't actually achieved. The difference at Christmas was not subtle. Emma and Derek arrived at the specific brightness my parents reserved for people whose presence they considered uncomplicated. Gifts addressed to them jointly. My mother touches Emma's arm in the natural, easy way of someone whose affection doesn't have to negotiate with itself before arriving. Diane and I were welcomed, genuinely, technically welcomed, and then treated with the slightly more careful warmth of guests rather than family. Present but adjacent. I had learned to read that difference with considerable precision. Diane had learned to carry it with the grace of someone who refused to let other people's limitations define the size of her own dignity. My mother said it during the Christmas dinner. We were talking about Emma and Derek's new house, the one the $80,000 had helped make possible, and my mother described it as a blessing. Then she looked across the table with the specific brightness of someone offering inclusion and said she hoped Diane and I were finding our own blessings too. The word did two things simultaneously in that sentence. It positioned Emma's situation as something divinely sanctioned and ours as something parallel but separate, running on a different track toward a different category of outcome. I looked at my mother and said that we were doing well, thank you. Diane smiled beside me with the patience of a woman who had decided long ago that she was not going to let a single word at a Christmas table determine the size of her life. I stopped attending family gatherings that didn't include Diane as my wife, not as a guest, not as my partner, not as my friend who came along, but as my wife. I communicated this once clearly, without lengthy explanation or emotional elaboration. I told my parents that Diane was my family and that I would attend events where she was welcome as family or I would not attend. My mother said she didn't understand why I was making things difficult. My father said he hoped I would reconsider. I said I had considered it carefully and this was my position. Then I ended the call. It was the cleanest boundary I had ever drawn with them. Not angry, not negotiable, just true. Two invitations arrived after that with Diane's name on them. I attended both. The third didn't include her. I didn't go. Nobody called to ask why. We bought the house in October, 2.5 years after the $80,000 conversation, 14 months of serious saving, the specific satisfaction of a closing day that nobody had made possible except us. It was a 1940s craftsman in a Minneapolis neighborhood I had loved since I moved to the city, good bones, original woodwork. A porch that wrapped around the front in a way that made you want to sit on it regardless of the weather. We had done the inspection, and the negotiation, and the paperwork with a thoroughness that came from knowing there was no safety net, and therefore every step had to be right. When we got the keys, I stood in the empty living room with Diane and felt something I want to describe accurately. Not triumph exactly, something quieter. The specific satisfaction of having built something real with your own hands and no one else's money. I sent my parents a photo of the house the day after we closed. Exterior shot, the porch visible, the morning light hitting the woodwork in a way that made it look like exactly what it was, something worth being proud of. I included one line of text. It said, "We bought our home." No explanation, no invitation to respond in any particular way, no request for anything. I sent it and put my phone down and went back to the business of moving in. My father replied that evening. His message was warm, genuinely warm, I believe, and said he was glad we had found a place and hoped we would be happy there. It was the message of a man trying to bridge something without addressing the thing that required bridging. I read it once and felt the specific weight of what it didn't say. Then I put the phone away and went to help Diane arrange the living room. 3 years is long enough for a life to become genuinely unrecognizable from its starting point if you work at it with consistent intention. The house became a home, renovations done on weekends, a garden Diane started in the backyard that produced more tomatoes than we knew what to do with, a guest room that filled regularly with friends who came and stayed and left with the warm, slightly reluctant energy of people who didn't want to go. My career had grown in ways I hadn't predicted when I was making that first dedicated savings transfer. Diane's work had expanded significantly. We had built something that was not a consolation version of what my parents had funded for Emma. It was simply our life, full and real, and built from the ground up by two people who had decided that the absence of approval was not the same as the absence of possibility. My cousin Rachel called on a Thursday evening with the careful tone she used when she had information she felt obligated to share but uncertain about how it would land. She told me that Emma and Derek had been struggling, not a rough patch, something more sustained and serious. She didn't have specific details, but the picture she painted was of a marriage that had been under pressure for longer than the family had been acknowledging publicly. I received the information with genuine sadness. Emma was my sister, and whatever had happened between us in the shadow of our parents' choices had never touched the love I had for her specifically. I told Rachel to let Emma know she could call me. Then I sat with the news quietly and didn't talk about it until Diane came home. Emma called on a Sunday afternoon. Her voice had the specific quality of someone who has been carrying something heavy for long enough that the weight has become audible. She told me about the marriage, not all of it, but enough. The incompatibilities that had been present from the beginning and had grown rather than resolved. The financial stress that had accumulated in ways the $80,000 foundation hadn't ultimately protected against. The specific loneliness of being in a marriage that had stopped feeling like partnership and started feeling like cohabitation with someone who had become a stranger. She talked for 40 minutes. I listened without filling the spaces with advice she hadn't asked for. When she finished, she said, "I should have called you sooner." I told her, "You called, that's what matters." I didn't keep score with Emma. That felt important to name because it would have been understandable if I had the $80,000, the celebrated wedding, the years of being the daughter whose choices generated family investment rather than family judgment. But Emma was not responsible for what my parents had chosen, and she was my sister, and she was hurting, and those facts were more significant than any accounting of what had been given to whom. I offered her what I had: time, presence, the specific usefulness of someone who had built financial stability from nothing, and could speak practically about what that required. She came to Minneapolis twice that spring and stayed in our guest room, and Diane cooked, and we stayed up late talking, and it felt like recovering something that the previous 3 years had made temporarily inaccessible. Emma mentioned their parents' situation during her second visit, carefully, in the way you mention something you're not sure how to frame. The $80,000 had been the beginning rather than the full extent. There had been smaller transfers over the 3 years, help with a car, assistance during a period when Derek's income had been unstable, contributions toward expenses that had accumulated. My parents had given from a retirement picture that hadn't fully accounted for the giving. The disruption wasn't catastrophic, but it was real plans that had assumed a certain financial cushion now operating without one. Emma said it with the discomfort of someone delivering news they feel partially responsible for simply by having been the recipient of what generated it. I told her it wasn't her fault. I meant that completely. My mother called on a Wednesday evening 18 months after the last time we had spoken beyond the occasional text exchange that kept the connection technically alive without asking anything real of either of us. She opened with small talk, the weather in Minneapolis, something she had read that she thought I might find interesting. I let the small talk run its course because I understood it was a runway and I was waiting to see what it was building toward. About 12 minutes in, she began talking about how things had been difficult lately, about how retirement looked different than they had planned, about how they missed me. She said that word, missed, with the specific weight of someone who has been sitting with it for a while before they allowed themselves to say it out loud. I listened. I didn't rush toward the shape of what was coming. I just listened and let her find her way to it. I told Diane about my mother's call that same night. We sat at the kitchen table in the house we had built ourselves, and I told her everything: the small talk runway, the difficulty lately, the mist. Diane listened the way she always listened, and when I finished, she didn't tell me what to do or what to feel. She asked me one question: what did I want the relationship with my parents to look like 5 years from now? Not what I thought I should want. Not what would look like the right answer to someone watching from outside. What I actually wanted. I sat with that question for a long time, then I told her. I wanted something real, not managed, not conditional, not the version of family relationship that required Diane to be present in our home, but absent from my parents' acknowledgement of what our home was. Diane nodded. Then she said, then we need to know if they're ready for that before we open any door. They arrived together on a Saturday morning in October, my father's car pulling up to the curb, outside our craftsman house, with the morning light hitting the porch woodwork, exactly the way it had in the photo I had sent them 3 years earlier. I watched them from the kitchen window for a moment before going to the door. My father was wearing the jacket he wore to things he considered serious. My mother had her hands folded in front of her in the way she held herself when she was managing something that required management. They were standing together on our front path looking at the house, with an expression I couldn't fully read from the window, but that contained something I hadn't seen directed at this house before. Something that looked, from a distance, like it might be recognition of what they were looking at for the first time. I opened the front door before they reached the porch steps. My father looked up and the expression on his face moved through something quickly, surprise at the timing, then a kind of settling, the specific composure of a man who has prepared for a difficult thing and is now simply doing it. My mother's eyes went to the house first. The porch, the woodwork, the garden Diane had put in along the front path that was doing what gardens do in October in Minneapolis, which is finished beautifully and without apology. Then her eyes came to me. We stood there for one full second before anyone said anything. That second contained 3 years of distance, and a Saturday morning in October, and two people on a porch who had come because they needed something, and one woman at the door deciding what that meant. I stepped back and let them in, and Diane was in the living room, not positioned, not staged, simply present in her own home on a Saturday morning, the way she was present in her own home on every Saturday morning. She was wearing the gray sweater she wore when she was working from home and had a mug of coffee, and was standing near the bookshelf when my parents came through the door. My mother saw her first, and something moved across her face that I watched carefully. Not hostility, something more complicated. The specific expression of someone encountering the reality of a thing they had previously been able to keep theoretical. Diane looked at my parents and said good morning with the natural ease of a woman who had decided years ago that her home was her home, and she would be herself in every room of it. We sat in the living room, my parents on the sofa, Diane in the chair beside the window, me on the chair across from my parents. My father set his hands on his knees and looked at the coffee table for a moment before looking at me. He said they had come because things had been hard and because he had been doing a lot of thinking. He said it with the deliberate pacing of a man who has rehearsed something and is now discovering that the rehearsed version doesn't quite fit the actual room he's sitting in. He talked about their financial situation with more directness than I had expected: the retirement disruption, the transfers to Emma over the years, the current picture. He was honest about the numbers. What he was less clear about was what exactly he was asking for, and what, if anything, he understood needed to change in order for asking to be appropriate. My mother's approach to the conversation was different from my father's in ways that revealed they had not fully coordinated before coming. Where my father was focused on the practical, the financial situation, the current difficulty, the concrete shape of what they needed, my mother kept returning to the relational. She talked about missing me, about the distance of the past 3 years and how it had felt from her side, about wanting things to be different between us. She said Diane's name once, carefully, deliberately, like she had prepared herself to say it and was making sure she did. It landed in the room as something. Not enough, not by itself, but something. My father noticed she had said it and looked at the coffee table again. The two versions of their visit sat in the room simultaneously without fully aligning into one. I waited until both of them had finished saying what they had come to say. Then I asked them one question. I asked, not with anger, not with the performed calm of someone managing their emotion, but genuinely, whether they understood that helping them, in whatever form that might take, would mean helping Claire and Diane. That there was no version of assistance extended to me that didn't include my wife. That walking through this door and sitting on this sofa meant sitting in Diane's home and mine, not mine and someone who lived with me, not mine and a person whose presence was tolerated, but mine and my wife's equally and completely. I asked if they understood that. The question sat between us. My father looked at his hands. My mother looked at me. My father's answer was incomplete in a way that was honest rather than evasive. He said he was trying, and that trying was what he could offer right now. It was not the answer I had hoped for, but it was a real one, and I respected it more than a polished version would have earned. My mother's answer surprised me. She looked at Diane directly across the room, held her gaze, and said that she owed Diane an apology for 3 years of treating her marriage as something less than real. She said it clearly and without qualification. No scripture attached. No, but following the apology. Just the apology, directed at the right person, delivered with the specific cost of something that had required genuine internal work to arrive at. Diane received it with the steadiness of someone who had been waiting for it, without counting on it. Diane set her coffee mug down and leaned forward slightly in the chair beside the window and spoke for the first time since good morning. She didn't speak for long. She said that she and Claire had built everything in this house themselves, the down payment, the renovations, the garden, the life inside it, without help from anyone, and that they were proud of that. She said that what was being asked of them today was not nothing, and that she wanted Claire's parents to understand what they were asking, not to make it harder, but to make sure everyone in the room was clear about the size of the thing. Then she said that despite all of it, she wanted Claire to have a relationship with her parents if that relationship could be real. And that real, in this house, meant Diane was Claire's wife. Completely. Every time. She looked at my father when she said that last part.